It happened many years ago when I was only 10 years old, but because I witnessed things I shouldn't have seen, it haunted me to the point where I would never forget it. It was summer and I had a few months vacation. I used to play alone in the small yard in front of the house. A couple living with their elderly mother-in-law lived next door to my house. The neighbor couple frequently quarreled because they were only separated by a wall. I could always hear everything clearly, but I didn't understand what was going on because I was just a child at the time. I thought it was amusing to see them arguing and fighting like that, so whenever I heard an argument, I quickly climbed up to the pile of firewood next to the wall to listen. In this village, that man was known as a henpecked husband. When they fought, it was the wife who would assault him. They could argue about anything, from minor to major. His wife looked like a starving tiger, always rushing to her husband and scratching, so he frequently appeared with many wounds and bruises. This time too, he was scratched all over his face to the point of bleeding in front of his wife. The husband did not dare to fight back. He did not dare to curse back. He could only mumble a few sentences and then try to find a way to flee from his wife. And the wife continued to charge forward. The wife had a fierce face with sharp brows, and she couldn't catch up to her husband each time he ran away, so she could only stand behind and curse. She then went to the front door and sat there crying and bemoaning her fate. It was always the same. She had no shame. She just wanted to release her anger. Neighbors who heard the screaming and crying gathered to see the funny story, but no one was willing to help or comfort her because the entire village was so used to it. She cried until her face was wet with tears, and she didn't even notice the people laughing around her. She bemoaned the fact that she had been unlucky to marry such a dumb husband. The neighbors had the opportunity to talk and discuss as well, partly because they were fed up with her pointlessness. They believed that having such a daughter-in-law was a bad omen for the husband's family. They began talking about the mother-in-law, and it appeared that the mother-in-law couldn't control this daughter-in-law because whenever there was a problem, she didn't dare to intervene instead of allowing her abuse to continue. Her mother-in-law emerged from the house at the moment. She was very old, her face sorrowful as she looked at the daughter-in-law crying on the ground. She didn't dare to touch her, so she could only offer advice. Not only did it not work, but she was chastised as well. It was only when she cried hoarsely and tiredly and went into the house on her own that it came to an end. The husband fled until the evening before daring to return, but as soon as he got home they continued to argue. I was sleeping, but the arguing woke me up. At the time I wondered how they could live together in such a state. The argument continued until late at night. I wasn't sure when it would end because I also fell asleep during it, unable to wake up. The next morning I was playing ball alone in my yard again, and I kept hearing arguing in the neighbor's house. I knew for a fact that the couple was having an issue again. This time it appeared to be more serious. The wife was holding a large knife, and it seemed that she intended to hack her husband. The husband was terrified and didn't dare to protest. He then ran away from his wife, as he always did, despite her yelling behind him. I still wondered why he didn't have the courage to talk to his wife once to clear things up. It wasn't good to hide like that all the time. She gripped the knife tightly, tears in her eyes, and threatened to kill the entire family. I'd seen them argue before, but this time it was terrifying. I didn't hear their argument that night. Perhaps the husband didn't dare to come home. My mother rushed in from outside the next morning during breakfast to inform my father of some serious news. My mother told me that the wife hanged herself in the house, and when my father heard this, he was astounded. Because the two families were usually very close to each other, when we heard the news, my parents also rushed over there to assess the situation and offer assistance. When I heard about it, I ran after them as well. As a child, I couldn't imagine what it was like to hang to death, so I was eager to take a look. I pushed my way through the throngs outside the door and entered the courtyard, but as soon as I saw it, I was paralyzed with fear. My limbs were drenched in cold sweat. and motionless, and I was so terrified that I couldn't move. My eyes kept staring at it. This was the first time I had seen a horrifying scene like this, and I started to regret coming there out of curiosity. A few neighbors were assisting in the removal of her body. Her eyes were rolled up, her mouth wide open, her face pale, and her limbs white. Her dead body hanging from the ceiling. Why did she commit suicide? Her husband wasn't at home at that time. It seemed that he didn't return home all night. When he learned that his wife had been hanged, he returned and went to a burial team to bury his wife's body as soon as possible. According to the burier, the deceased should stay in the house for 3 days before being buried to avoid bad luck, which was an old tradition. But the husband was unconcerned about these traditions. He simply wanted to bury his wife as soon as possible. The burial team also carried the coffin to the village's cemetery quickly because they had been paid and because the tenant had requested it. On the way, the carriers were startled by a noise in the coffin, which sounded like the wife trying to knock on the coffin. When one of the group members heard it clearly, he panicked and told everyone to place the coffin on the ground to assess the situation before moving on. The 4 of them put down the coffin and stood dumbfounded, hoping to hear the knocking again, but it seemed to have stopped. They began to panic, wondering whether they should open the coffin lid to look inside, because the noise was not their imagination, but rather a fear that an animal was hiding inside that would devour the corpse. So the 4 of them decided to open the coffin lid to see what was inside, even though they were all a little scared. Indeed, seeing the wife's body stunned them. Their faces were blue and bloodless. The wife opened her white eyes. Her mouth was open and stretched her arms forward as if she wanted to strangle someone. She looked very resentful, like she couldn't die in peace. One of the group's most experienced members panicked and hastily asked someone to go to the village and find a heavy object made of silver or steel, but it had to be brought quickly or bad luck would occur. The husband was following them and saw the scene. He got scared and asked the buyer to explain the situation. He wanted to know whether it could be solved or not. According to the bury worker, because the old procedures were incorrect and deceased still harbored a great deal of resentment, if they did not quickly place a gin-heavy object on top, the body would likely rise. The husband was too scared, so he turned pale when he heard this. Burial workers rushed to close the coffin, but inside it was growing stronger and stronger, and the constant knocking and pounding on the coffin caused it to shake. A moment later, the members of the group returned, holding something resembling a pendulum. The worker placed the steel pendulum gently and carefully on the top of the coffin lid. After a while, everybody kept silent to observe it. It truly worked. There was no sound inside the coffin. Seeing this, they quickly took the coffin and buried it, knowing that this method would not last long. The worker cast a glance at the husband, who smiled slightly as he saw his wife's coffin being buried. He didn't ask many questions. He just warned him that if he was involved in his wife's death, she would eventually find him, and it wouldn't be so simple. And indeed, the mother-in-law witnessed her son hang himself in his room just a few days later. He died the same way as his wife. The entire village believed she forced him to follow her, which I wouldn't know for sure. They didn't live happily together, and even death didn't want to set them free from each other. So they left, leaving the old mother to suffer alone.